Being born a girl in many ancient civilizations was often a cause for sadness. Families waited eagerly for a son, an heir to carry on the family name, the throne, the job, or simply to help with the household work. But ancient Egypt stood out as a real exception. We know plenty of joyful stories about girls who were deeply wanted, long awaited, and became cherished, happy members of the family. Right here in front of you is a beautiful wall painting from the tomb of the nobleman Nebamun. This dates to the end of the 15th century BCE. The painting was brought to the British Museum in London. On the Nile's low, gently flowing waters, a light reed boat glides along. Water lilies bloom in the water. Nile fish dart by. Thick papyrus thickets part to reveal hidden marshes. This wonderful work of art almost lets us hear the chatter of birds. Those very birds that lived in the Nile marshes. The nobleman Nebamun himself is hunting them with a throwing stick. Helping his master in the thickets is a huge gray cat, which also ties into the cult of Ra, the sun god. But right now, that's not our main focus. Behind him stands his beloved wife, in a classic ritual pose, holding a splendid bouquet. She's wearing the finest pleated linen gown. In addition to the formal bouquet, flowers adorn her head, and on top of her wig sits an aromatic cone, the classic sign of festivity in a beautiful day. As we remember, elite Egyptian women placed these scented cones on their wigs during banquets. At the father's feet, clinging to his leg, sits a little girl. She has the youth lock, the side lock of youth that both boys and girls in Egypt wore until about age 5, a clear symbol of childhood. The shape of the lock varied by gender, and here it's the girl's version. She's holding onto her clearly adored father by the leg, and in her other hand, she carries a water lily she just picked during this delightful Nile boat ride. She's obviously from a wealthy family. Look at her earrings, the broad beaded collar, and that beautiful golden pendant in bright yellow tones, where gold symbolizes the sun and eternal life. So here she is, a happy, wanted little girl, born into a family that truly cherished her, probably both parents equally. The way Egyptians felt about their daughters shines through in their names. A girl could be called Neferet, beauty, or the beautiful one. She could be Merit, beloved, or even Nojemet, sweet one. And sometimes the names got wonderfully elaborate, like Bastet Ir Dabu, she whom Bastet protects, or other equally magical ones. There were even names meaning another one, or a second, which shows that even though Egyptians adored children of both genders, the eldest son, the heir, was always the one most eagerly awaited. Still, judging from the sources that have come down to us, that longing for a son never diminished the love and welcome given to daughters. Girls were frequently wanted, treasured, and deeply loved from the moment of birth.
Egyptian women giving birth. This is a difficult topic because despite the incredibly high level of Egyptian medicine, which, as we remember, was the best in the ancient world, child mortality was still extremely high. And here on this fragment of a relief from the first millennium BCE, we see the goddess Nut, the sky goddess, sitting on the birth bricks and giving birth to the most important of her daughters, the goddess Isis. 2 heavenly midwives and the cows, Haysat and Meskenet, support her from both sides. But looking at the goddess, we can very clearly picture an Egyptian woman giving birth in that very African-style tradition, squatting on her haunches. And of course, the whole world of midwives, those who practice village medicine or, on the contrary, palace medicine. This dangerous world, as Egyptian texts describe it, is emphasized here because childbirth was always extremely dangerous. We know that very often in Egyptian homes, children who died during birth were not buried in the necropolis, but right under the floor of the family's own entrance hall, so that this much-desired child, whom the parents wanted so badly, could pass through the mother's womb again and return, this time being born fully, without any obstacles or consequences, and enter the life of this family. In the city of Wasut, in the house of the local governor, American archaeologists in the early 2000s discovered such a birth brick. You see here at the bottom the actual artifact, and above it a drawing. It had two emblems of the goddess Bastet Hathor, that is, the mistress of motherhood, the happiest mother who already holds her newborn baby in her arms, and the midwives, the obstetricians, the friends. All these women connected with childbirth are present here beside her, rejoicing and celebrating as they look at the happy mother holding her little one in her arms. The world of Egyptian art has brought down to us a large number of images of girls from different social strata. Naturally, there are far more depictions of girls from wealthy families. And if a boy at 5 years old received his first kilt, shaved off the youth lock, and let his hair grow in some style or simply shaved his head. But the main thing was that he went to school, went to the temple school to learn to read, write, and count. That is, to become a literate person and lay the foundation for his future career. A girl did not go to school. If she was a peasant's daughter, she learned the basics of household management together with her mother. But if the woman came from a wealthier family, or if there was at least a desire in that family to help their daughter find herself not only as someone's wife, but as a personality, then they would hire a teacher, and the teacher would work with the girl at home. And here's something very interesting. I'll talk about it in more detail a little later. In ancient Egypt, there was no strict gender division between teachers and students like in many other cultures. Do you know what gender division in education means? Men teach boys, women teach girls. There was nothing like that here. Very often, a man was the teacher who worked with a noble Egyptian girl. And speaking about all this, I'm showing you a wonderful piece from the Berlin Museum. Such a young beauty. Still quite young, but with a magnificent wig and that romantic cone on her head. And as a completely charming detail, she holds a little kitten, her pet, in her arms, looking at her. This is roughly the 14th century BCE. We can imagine what an Egyptian girl looked like. Before we move on to talk about education in temple schools, this still belongs to childhood. And even though we don't know that much about it, I really want to show you an absolutely amazing artifact from the collection of the Metropolitan Museum in New York. This is one of the oldest known mechanical dolls. A doll like this was certainly expensive, very finely made, and was most likely the favorite toy of some Egyptian girl who lived between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE. The figure depicts a woman, and if you pull the string from behind, her arms move. Only one arm has survived, but still, this is one of the oldest mechanical dolls. And right now in front of you. Actually, of course, childhood was most likely quite happy, because in Egypt they really loved children, and numerous texts.
Numerous texts, including all kinds of instructional teachings, strongly advise a young man to start a family as soon as possible, find himself a worthy woman, give up any dubious relationships, and by all means, have a large number of children. A large number of children, boys or girls, it didn't matter, ensured the continuity of life in that family because, as we recall again, child mortality was extremely high. So having many children was the guarantee of successfully continuing the life of this family and this lineage. I'm not using the word lineage by accident, because in the Egyptian concept, the bloodline, the rot, is transmitted through the blood, and it passes through the mother's blood. just as, for example, it happens in Judaism. So yes, of course, property, family status, and opportunities came from the father. But Egyptian sages of every kind advised a young man to avoid women of unknown origin, because it is precisely the woman and her blood that will carry the information, which then becomes part of the life situation, part of the family of this young man. And this applied not only to the social sphere, but also to medicine, because the same Egyptian medical texts, in particular the famous Ebers papyrus, state that all the blood and all the characteristics of the soft, liquid parts of the body, the soft tissues and body fluids, are transmitted from the mother, while bones, tendons, all the dry structural parts of the body are passed on to the Egyptian from his father. Here's another toy, this time from Leiden, from the National Museum of Antiquities. Rather sad, because it's a grinding stone with a grain quern, and you see a string at the back that you can pull, and you can play with such a toy, picturing how in a poor peasant family a woman uses a stone and a quern to grind grain into flour so she can bake flatbread. We'll talk more about women's occupations today. Even such amazing testimonies of the world of childhood have survived to our days from ancient Egypt, and I think it's very important to mention this. I've already started talking about education, and here before you are two pieces of evidence showing just how prestigious the title of royal tutor was. On the left is a completely non-canonical, utterly delightful statue of Senenmut, the favorite architect, vizier, and apparently the lover of Hatshepsut, who among his most important titles counted that of tutor to the royal daughter, Princess Neferur. And here the little princess girl is held in his arms, and besides having the youth sidelock, she also has her finger to her mouth. This is yet another canonical symbol of childhood in the Egyptian tradition. And on the right is another such teacher a bit later. His name was something like Ineni, or similar. But he was the tutor to Princess Meritamen, one of the daughters of Pharaoh Thutmose III. This is all still the 15th century BCE. We traditionally call such statues block statues, or cube statues. And this image shows a seated man who with his clothing simultaneously covers his pupil. He covers her from all kinds of troubles, providing the protection of an adult to a child. The stylized depiction of these garments is covered with hieroglyphs that allow us to tell the biography of this person. Both monuments are in the collection of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Unfortunately, looking at these delightful images, this time from Egyptian tombs of the 2nd millennium, BCE, we know practically nothing about Egyptian weddings. Apparently there was no grand ceremonial ritual. We know that a man and a woman gave an oath. The oath was given in the presence of elders. And here we encounter such a structure of Egyptian society as the Kenbet, the Council of Elders, which witnessed the fact of the oath. And then, apparently, with quite solemn processions, the woman moved into her husband's house. Naturally, there was also something similar to a bride price or kalim in Islamic culture, because a certain gift was prepared, a gift made of very valuable materials or precious jewelry, which at the moment of concluding the marriage became an inalienable part of the woman's property, regardless of how her fate turned out later. Quite often, naturally, marriages were arranged, as was always the case in the East, not for love but for economic reasons, plus the traditional desire of Egyptians to preserve the nobility of their lineage. Therefore, a fairly large number of marriages in Egypt were concluded between relatives. I'm not talking, of course, about the truly extreme situation of marriage between brother and sister. Such cases did exist in the royal house, but they were not numerous. But marriages between uncles and nieces or between cousins were apparently quite numerous. This kind of distant kinship allowed the family to keep property within the family. From royal documents, we know that a daughter of the land of Egypt was not given in marriage to a foreigner, with rare exceptions, I'll say again. And thanks to these strictly mono-ethnic marriages, the Egyptians naturally managed to preserve the purity of their blood, because like many other ancient peoples, they quite naturally considered only themselves a special people among the 4 races that they distinguished in the ancient world back then. There wasn't any grand religious ceremony for marriage. At least over several thousand years of ancient Egyptian history, we have no indication of any special rite that would seal the marriage on a divine level. Ancient Egyptian sculpture and art have brought down to us a huge number of the most varied images of happy married couples. I'll show you different examples. And we'll start with the wonderful nobleman Sekemka, who was a contemporary of the kings of the 5th dynasty and lived in the 25th century BCE. This remarkable statue was sold from one of the British museums to a private collection in the United Arab Emirates and became very famous after that. But what interests me here is something else. The gentleman himself sits proudly in his courtly pose. He holds an unrolled papyrus in his hands. Next to the bottom, on the base, there's a relief, and also on the cube-shaped throne where he sits, there are depictions of his relatives and the funerary priests whose activities are connected with immortality through his name. But look at the monument. It's exceptional, in fact. See how elegant it is despite all the canonicity. His wife sits next to him, holding his leg on one side. Here, this is not a derogatory pose for a woman. We're talking strictly about social status. We'll talk a lot about that today. But at the same time, the artist allowed himself to depict the woman with a clearly portrait-like resemblance on this canonical monument. See how elegant and sweet she is. And the leg doesn't just hang off the statue's pedestal a little bit. He brings the whole image to life with this small gesture. Between the master, the entire image of the sculpture, and the image of the happy marriage, there are a lot of such depictions in Egyptian art. And I'll just show you several together. Starting with the very ancient ones from the Old Kingdom monuments, and then examples from subsequent eras so we can see how these married couples tried to present themselves attending a gala reception next to their husband. Here's a fairly ancient example. This is also from the 5th dynasty. Pay attention. They are the same height, meaning this is a family where he greatly honored his wife. Their names are Neferirkare, or similar for him. He was a scribe of the pharaoh's granaries, and his wife's name was something like Nefret or similar, rarely written out in full. The titles and names are written next to the images because all these sculptural groups, as we understand, are funerary art. That is, statues intended for tombs. They represent the deceased themselves, and when placed in a certain chamber of the tomb, they should receive sacrifices from descendants or from those who come to the tombs, who will bring, if not gifts, then at least pronounce the names and thus fulfill the cherished dream of all Egyptians, to remain forever. You'll agree. We're now looking at a monument from the 25th century BCE, and in general the dream came true. We have many names at least, first names, and then we'll be able to see the stories. This one is also from the Berlin Museum, a sculpture of a Theban husband and wife dating to the 15th century BCE, that is, before the new era. Art monuments are becoming more refined and elegant, but some semantic positions are changing within the Egyptian worldview, from ancient times since the Pyramid era all the way to the Ptolemaic period, and therefore this type of sculptural group of a happy married couple in a variety of additions that the artist could bring, with elements of costumes that allow us to date the monument, with texts that mention the titles and names of those depicted, runs through the entire axis of Egyptian culture. In every major museum in the world, we can see such a couple, or that married pair. It's clear that the man was the head of the household, and the woman also showed submission. Men could file for divorce if he understood that the marriage was over. And in exactly the same way, with absolutely equal rights, a woman could also file for divorce and declare the marriage complete. Moreover, from written sources, we know the fates of many women who, for one reason or another, found themselves in a situation of 2 or even 3 marriages. And despite the fact that this was a traditional Eastern society, no one considered them second-class women. Naturally, only one wife was assigned a special title. I'll talk about that in more detail soon. But nevertheless, a woman was not limited by her first marriage. In principle, she could choose her partner, and in any case, had the chance to build a happy destiny. We have amazing legal documents that I'm showing you. First, a relief depicting a priestess and her husband, both prepared in Memphis. Let's take a look at it because the work is exceptional. Appreciate the pleated dress of the lady, the wig, and the aromatic cone on her head. It's like a gentle, completely jewel-like execution of fingers resting on the hand of her own spouse. But what's nearby is more in the legal realm. It's a fragment of a papyrus from the 12th century BCE, a fragment of the famous will of the Lady Naunakta. This will consist of 4 fragments like these, performed at the request of the lady by one of the best scribes of his time. What are we talking about? The fact is that the Lady Naunakta, who was a contemporary of Ramesses, married a very elderly official who was a royal scribe and managed the villages and settlements of the royal builders in Thebes' tombs. This position was very high, and this is Mr. Ka. He was both a scribe and a writer, and apparently dabbled in his spare time because his library has been preserved. There are a lot of magical scrolls and even a dream book. So his wife became a young, apparently spectacular woman. But there's one very interesting thing here for us. Apparently she truly loved him. That is, it wasn't just a marriage of convenience. Because when her first husband, Ka, dies, she marries a second time. Since her first marriage was childless, in her second marriage she gives birth to 8 children. That is quite a large family. 2 of her spouses called home run, and so she names the first child she has with the second husband, something like Kenna or similar, Ka Emnun, or in honor of her first deceased husband. A fairly long life passes, and Naunakta goes to the Kenbet, that is, to the court of elders, and in front of witnesses she gives an oral will. The fact is that out of 8 children, 5 children treated their mother well, took care of her, behaved decently, roughly speaking, and 3 children in general seem not to have been very concerned with mom. They were dealing with their own problems. And according to the will, Mrs. Naunakta decides on their share of the inheritance in that part which belongs to her. What am I talking about? There is common family property in this family. From this inheritance, she allocates her own share. This share, first of all, includes, let's say, the amount of conditional bride price which was once paid by both her husbands. And thus, all of her property is divided into 8 parts. And all the children receive equal shares, since no grandson has an advantage over his share. She allocates this between the 5 children she has chosen. The 3 children who were inattentive to their mother are thus deprived of part of the inheritance, and she has full legal right to her own share of this property. Finally, what's also touching is that apparently this eldest son, whom she named in honor of her first husband, was especially beloved. Because of this will, part of which is kept in Cairo, and part of which I'm showing you this fragment now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, here she bequeaths to this very eldest beloved son some very beautiful bronze vessel, which she loved very much. Bronze is an expensive thing,
And here she again, in the will, separately writes that this favorite item of hers should go to this very eldest beloved son. I beg your pardon. This is not the only example of such a will. And in fact, if you look at the vast history of ancient Egypt, a woman, if she possessed a bright character and some support from her parents, she could succeed not only in her family.
How could something like this even happen legally? How could a woman pursue a real profession, even as far back as the Pyramid Age? We have funeral stelae of women who worked as gynecologists or dentists. This was a completely separate medical career path. And what's crucial, these women weren't mentioned just by their husbands. These are their own stelae and titles. Of course, they respectfully mentioned their spouses too, but these were their personal achievements. This speaks volumes about their legal status, and we'll come back to this point many times today. It shows just how high a position women held in Egyptian society during the pharaonic era. Here's another stunning happy couple, exceptional in its artistic quality, a relief from the tomb of Ramses. Ramses was the Grand Vizier of Egypt from the end of Amenhotep III's reign right into the beginning of Akhenaten's. That's the 14th century BCE. On the wall, there's a funeral feast scene. And among all these brilliant Egyptian couples attending the memorial service for the chief of the forestry troops, Amenhotep is right here in front of you with his beloved wife. Her name translates to something like delicious or sweet one. And I can barely tear my eyes away from her pleated clothing, the flowers, everything rendered with incredible mineral precision. Just look at the beauty captured in this frame. When ancient Egyptian texts describe couples like this, they often use specific terms for the relationship between a man and a woman. But before I dive into that in detail, let me remind you, around the 7th century BCE, we start seeing written marriage contracts. They probably existed earlier, but the ones we know in detail begin then. In these contracts that regulate relations between husband and wife, a very important term appears, Shem MBTPR, or something like she who is lady of the house. But more precisely, it's tied to property called ship-in, or irresistible property. This is the indivisible property that becomes her inalienable possession. It essentially secures her future if she becomes a widow, or if the marriage somehow falls apart. Even in the first marriage, it gives her this capital, naturally in the form of objects, necklaces, clothes, rings, and other valuable items. So here's a fragment from a 7th century BCE marriage contract. I have taken you as my wife. I have given you this and that. If I repudiate you because I hate you or because I want to take another woman as wife instead of you, I will give you even more than what I originally gave you as your ship-in property. And I will give you 1/3 of everything we will have acquired together on that day. Appreciate that. This is absolutely extraordinary for the entire ancient world, looking not just at these beautiful images, but also at this kind of legal evidence. We can truly appreciate how protected Egyptian women were from any failures in marriage. Texts quite often talk about he, the spouse, and MBTPR, the mistress or lady of the house. It's very important for this household. There's also a separate term in the text, T MBTPR, which can be translated as married woman, worthy lady, or woman who has taken a vow. When a woman becomes the legal wife of her husband, no matter if he's a peasant or the son of a pharaoh, from that moment on, in texts connected to her, a key title appears, MBTPR, the mistress of the house. She's not just the lady, she's the ruler of the house. For example, Hathor is called the mistress of heaven, but an ordinary married and more or less happy woman is the mistress of the house. And when Egyptian texts list any titles associated with a woman's name, for example, she's a temple singer or chantress. The most significant title, the one closest to her name, is always this one: NBTPR. It's the respected, blessed status of a married woman who is about to become a mother and who therefore occupies a very important place in the Egyptian social structure.
Finally, it seems women were often tied or assigned to a specific city in some way. Let me remind you again. It was through the mother's blood that certain strength and lineage were passed down. There's a term like on hand or something similar. Basically living in a particular city. And this little postscript would indicate whether she was from Thebes, Memphis, the capitals, or some provincial town. Either way, it highlighted her provincial or metropolitan status. There's one very important thing besides that. There's also the wife who bears the title T, simply spouse or wife. But there's a special female title like chief wife or principal wife, not just any wife, but the first or primary one. So if a man's wife dies and he takes another, only one of his wives will receive this special title, T. It's the wife who bore the main responsibility and honor of building the family, creating the home. I'll say right away, Egyptian society was basically monogamous. It was very rare for a wealthy nobleman to have several wives at the same time. Such examples are quite rare today outside the royal house. For instance, when His Majesty Rameses II officially had 59 recognized wives. But that's a total exception to every rule. Most often there was just one wife who gave birth to many children. Egyptian texts urge men in every way to treat their wife with dignity, to feed and clothe her properly, because she, as often happens in the East, was the face of her husband. When a nobleman appeared in public with his wife, you could tell everything about the man himself from her wig, her jewelry, her grooming, her overall appearance. It reflected directly on him and how he was regarded. Right after marriage, Egyptians always wanted to have lots of children. Of course, that didn't always work out. We have cases preserved in history where a couple was childless. For example, in the 15th century BCE, the couple Nebnefer and Renefer tried in vain to have offspring. It just didn't happen. In any other ancient civilization, whether Assyria or Greece, there would most likely have been a divorce, and the woman would have been left sad and completely unprotected. But here it's a completely different story. He loved his wife deeply, so they bought a slave girl for him. She ended up giving birth to 6 children, but all 6 of those children were adopted by Mrs. Renefer. Judging by what we know, the attitude toward this slave woman was very good. She essentially became a second wife in practice, and this was their solution to the problem. No one in society could call Mrs. Renefer infertile anymore. These were the methods they used to preserve the status of the woman as the first and beloved spouse. Such examples in Egyptian history are not isolated at all. There are quite a few, at least in those social layers from which some written records have survived, allowing us to judge these things. Another example. A stela from the Cairo Museum, 19th century BCE, Lord Urdison or similar. But we're in Middle Egypt. He was a very high-ranking nobleman during the reign of the pharaohs. On this funerary stela found in his tomb, he is depicted together with 2 wives and his daughter. What's interesting is that the 2 ladies are shown in absolutely the same status, dressed identically, with the same magnificent Hathoric wigs on their heads. But most fascinating, the inscription on each starts with the phrase, his beloved spouse for the first and his beloved wife for the second. So there's this deliberate equality. The daughter is also clearly very beloved, the eldest one chosen to be depicted at the funeral stele. She's very young here, with her father. She has those wonderful youth sidelocks on both sides. Fashionable dress, her name written on it. She's the favorite daughter of her master, her father. But here the 2 wives are depicted so deliberately equal that it rather suggests the nobleman wanted it this way. Plus, everything points to high status, something more associated with the royal house than with classical private life. But still, despite the fact that, I repeat again, despite the two wives being of exactly the same status, dressed the same, with the same wigs and jewelry, everything is arranged so carefully that both feel equal and neither is offended. Both are beloved by their master. We are looking at a priest of Hathor, the goddess of love and beauty. This is the image of a truly happy family. Here's a facsimile copy of a painting from the tomb of the royal artist Ipuy. He lived in the 13th century BCE and was a contemporary of the great Rameses II. Unfortunately, the original painting has survived in worse condition, but thanks to the magnificent work of the artist Nina de Garis Davies, who in the first half of the 20th century copied these scenes with incredible precision and attention to detail, we can see the splendid paintings as they looked back when they were still in much better shape. Let's take a look at this wall. It's incredibly beautiful. We see two couples divided by a lavish offering table piled high with all kinds of gifts. On the left is Ipuy himself and his wife. I'll point out not just their magnificent clothing, wigs, necklaces, and pendants, but also the beautiful cats here. Pay attention to the kitten on his lap, and the luxurious cat looking right at us from under his wife's chair. They are already deceased, righteous ancestors, and their children have come to meet them. Unfortunately, the son's name here is destroyed, but the beloved daughter, the favorite of her master Ipuy, is holding bouquets of flowers and offerings in her hands, along with her brothers and sisters. On the son, there's a stylized leopard skin sash, which shows his status as a participant in the funerary cult. This is probably how the ancient Egyptians pictured the ideal family. And in the royal settlement of the craftsmen who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, an enormous number of documents and testimonies have been preserved about how these artists actually lived, because almost all of them could read and write. We don't just have ceremonial records. We have correspondence, complaints, personal notes, even libraries. Thanks to this village, known in ancient times as Set Mat, the place of truth, and today called Deir el Medina, on the west bank of the Nile opposite Luxor, we can learn so much about Egyptian society. These texts often show a far less idealized picture than the one right in front of you now. I'll retell a few fragments. For example, one document describes an artist named Sekhmet, a poor, struggling painter. But he had an incredibly beautiful wife. In the end, the wife started an affair with a high-ranking official, one of the singers from this very village of royal builders and craftsmen. The wife left this unfortunate artist and began receiving very expensive gifts. Naturally, her friends reported it, out of envy, of course, and the whole situation became quite scandalous. Then this official, whose name isn't mentioned in the surviving text, was summoned to the court of elders, the Kembit. He swore an oath, quote, "I will never speak to this woman again. I don't know if she spoke to me or not." But after some time, it turned out the woman was pregnant by him, and the situation became completely unacceptable in Egyptian society. The official's father brought his wayward son to court, and there the son swore he would never approach this woman again. A divorce never actually happened in this case. But here's a curious detail to show you that nothing has really changed since the 2nd millennium BCE. When this poor artist first wrote a complaint against the official and his own wife, his first punishment was a beating for making the accusation. Only because one of the great royal masters, a Raphael of his time, stood up for this poor artist, who was already a professional in his field, did the case get any further investigation. Thanks to that brigade leader's intervention, the poor artist's honor, Sekhmet's, began to be defended in some way through this communal, kinship-based court.
Another story tells about a different official who had an affair with one of the women in the village. The affair lasted a full 8 months. It's even specifically noted in the papyrus. Exactly 8 months. A very long time. And then people started condemning him. First and foremost because his behavior deeply humiliated his official wife. The text says something like this: a woman can have options too. If he had acted honestly, divorced her, explained everything, she could have taken back her marriage oath, found a worthy man for herself, and continued her life in a new family. But because this man kept sneaking off to his mistress in secret, despite all the rumors, she had no official grounds for divorce. The situation escalated so far that her friends went to beat up her husband's lover. They were ready to tear out all her hair. Thankfully, the senior scribe of the village of artists stepped in when he saw the angry crowd of women, and the mob was stopped. No one actually harmed the mistress, though the friends were furious enough to do it. This scandalous situation blew up and became the subject of a formal court investigation. The text literally says something like this: for a full 8 months, right up to this day, he has been sleeping with this woman, even though he is not her husband. If he were her husband, wouldn't he have broken the oath regarding his own wife? The crowd was calmed down, but then the respected and noble people of the village turned to this woman, the mistress, and said to her, "Why do you keep accepting him? Why does this man's heart follow you? Let him go to court with his wife. Let him break the oath, and then he can return to your house in a worthy way." There are quite a few such stories from the 2nd millennium BCE in Egypt, and they show, even if they're not always the most flattering episodes of private life, how Egyptian society actually reacted. They didn't react so much to the fact that he had a mistress. They reacted to the fact that it should be done openly. You need to divorce. You need to provide a decent future for your former wife so she can possibly find happiness in her next marriage and family. There are tons of examples like this, but agree. The image of a crowd of girlfriends marching to beat up the mistress and rip out her hair adds such incredible liveliness and humanity to events that happened in the 13th century BCE. Here's another ideal family, also from Deir el-Medina, this time from the 12th century BCE. This is a depiction of the great royal master Inherkau, one of the most outstanding artists of Egypt during the reign of Ramesses III, since the artists painted each other's tombs. What we're looking at now is the decoration of Inherkau's own burial chamber. There are so many unusual, touching details here that on one hand break the strict canons of Egyptian art, but on the other hand, reveal very human feelings. Who do we see? On the left side sits Inherkau himself, and right behind him is his wife. The same situation repeats with their descendants bringing offerings and gifts to their ancestor. But what really interests me here is the depiction of the children, 3 girls and 1 boy. And these are not the children of Inherkau and his wife. These are their grandchildren. It's written literally right there. If you look at the tall figure of the central girl, she's shown nude, with the youth sidelock and a fashionable hairstyle in the so-called Nubian style. Very trendy back then, plus earrings and necklaces. Because she's still a little baby, she's depicted naked on one hand, but on the other, look at her wrists and ankles. Bracelets everywhere. It's an attempt to show the status and belonging of this tiny girl to the very well-off family of Master Inherkau. Right next to her it's written, "Child of his daughter, Bakhet Ptah," justified, the right-eyed one. It suggests she probably died in infancy, but nevertheless, all these figures, the 3 girls and the boy, are grandchildren, beloved granddaughter and grandson. They're not just depicted here for eternity. They're placed right next to their grandmother and grandfather. Look at the tenderness with which Inherkau holds his little granddaughter, this very Bakhet Ptah, with one hand, gently grasping the youth's sidelock on her head. It's such an amazing way to show warmth and affection. And on the other side, there's this tiny little granddaughter sitting right at her grandfather's feet. She's reaching out to touch a bird that was clearly given as a gift to the older girl. You can feel her emotions here. The desire to have the same toy, the same gift that her big sister got. It's demonstrated so vividly and interestingly. In reality, Situations like long-lasting marriages and harmonious family life were very common in Egypt. We know about this thanks to a genre called letters to the dead. It sounds grim, but there's actually nothing morbid about it. When a person, say, a husband, lost his wife, and he had some problem he wanted to bring before the higher judges in the afterlife, he would go to the necropolis, take a simple clay bowl or cup, fill it with any liquid suitable for offerings: wine, beer, milk, water, whatever. And before pouring it in, he would write his letter right on the surface of the bowl. He would ask his deceased wife, or sometimes a wife would write to her husband to fulfill a certain request. Usually it was about healing someone in the family or granting good fortune to a family member. But to justify why the request was reasonable and to lay out the foundation for it, he would usually start by describing how good their relationship had been. There was no point in lying here, because in the afterlife, she remembers everything and knows the truth. Here's a fragment from one such letter to the dead. I married you when I was young. I was with you when I carried out my various duties. I was with you, and I never divorced you. I never caused grief to your heart. I entered into this marriage when I was young, and while performing all kinds of important service for the king. May he live, be prosperous and healthy. I never divorced you. And so on. This worthy man continues with his request. But pay attention. He says that many positions and duties passed by over the years, but when he was still very young, he chose exactly this woman. And even after gaining power and apparently wealth, he didn't divorce her. He stayed with this wife and honored her in every way. Examples where a man sought a new wife after getting a new position aren't that common.
The enchanting world of ancient Egyptian women doesn't end here. We've walked with them through sunlit mornings of milk and mirrors, through palaces fragrant with myrrh and lotus, through banquets where mandrake apples were passed hand to hand and love poetry whispered like the Nile breeze. We've seen their golden collars gleam beneath sheer linen, their eyes rimmed with protective kohl, their bodies adorned with cowrie shell girdles that sang with every step, their foreheads crowned with delicate gazelle horns, symbols of grace, fertility, and quiet royal power. Even in the silence of the tomb, their beauty refused to fade. The serene face of Chuyu, mother of a queen, still radiates calm eternity. The untouched treasures of merit, golden masks, human hair wigs, alabaster perfume jars, speak of a life saturated with love and luxury. But this is only the beginning of the deepest mysteries. In the very next video, we plunge straight into the heart of ancient Egyptian sensuality and sacred beauty. The legendary Kai-Fi perfume revealed. Full temple recipes with wine, raisins, honey, frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, mint, juniper, and secret narcotic touches of mandragora. How these divine scents were blended, worn on the skin, burned in temples, and used to seduce both mortals and gods. Exquisite cosmetic treasures, duck and baboon-shaped alabaster vessels, sacred Baz jars named after Bastet herself, glowing core-formed glass coal tubes, ritual spoons of nude swimmers and gazelles carrying melting perfume cones, the intoxicating rhythm of banquets and love, acrobatic dancers with open breasts, mandrake fruit symbolizing uncontrollable passion, erotic garden scenes from love songs and ostraca, transparent pleated robes letting jewelry shine through like stars in twilight. The final journey, widowhood, professional mourners tearing their hair, breathtaking burials of noble ladies, including Merit's perfect tomb and Tuyu's anointed mummy mask still clinging to fragrant linen, paired Shabti couples dreaming of eternal togetherness in the fields of reeds, and the promise that true beauty conquers even death. If the elegance, the sense, the poetry, and the raw feminine power of ancient Egypt have already stolen your heart, then the next episode will take your breath away completely. This is where fragrance becomes immortality, where desire meets the divine, where every detail, from a single pomegranate to a lotus-adorned banquet, reveals the soul of a civilization obsessed with beauty, love, and eternal life. Don't miss it. Subscribe right now. Turn on the bell. The scents of eternity are calling.